Professor Douglas Baird, who is the Garstang Chair of Archaeology at the University of Liverpool. Doug probably needs no introduction, as he is also a legend in his time in terms of Anatolian archaeology and Neolithic archaeology. But he's also a thoroughly fantastic human being. I remember when I first met him in the flesh, he helped me to to examine a PhD thesis for the first time. And he was incredibly generous as a scholar and as a person. So I'm very, very happy to be introducing Doug, and very, very excited to hear what he has to tell us about coprolites, continuity, and consanguinity. Consanguinity. I'm going to leave that word. Life histories and house histories at Neolithic Boncuklu. Before Doug, you get carried and take it away, I would encourage everyone to start typing questions in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and we will put them to Doug at the end of his talk. Are you okay to share your screen? Yes, fantastic.
Yes, I guess I am. Sorry, let me just go into full screen mode. There, can everyone see? Can you see that okay, Nisha? If you can, I guess everyone can.
Yep, that looks great.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that very generous introduction. Like Nisha, before I actually start, I'd also like to proffer my thanks to Shahina and Stephen and Anthony for all the great work they've done for BIA and BIAA, and I think the Boncuklu project, its successes to the extent they exist are very much due to the bedrock that the BIAA provides, and obviously its honorary officers and other members of the executive are key in delivering on the BIAA's goals. So certainly the project and I have benefited, I think, from their great work as well. Nisha has introduced the title. Obviously, I set a tongue twister just to see what happened, and I'm certainly going to take that challenge up. I think you can see on the screen the nature of the title, and the individual elements of it will become clear through the course of the talk. As I said, it's great to be talking at a BIAA event because of the sponsorship and support of the BIAA, ensuring that the project has been able to continue for 16 years, over which course we've dug for 15 of them. So I think, we've got quite a lot of results, and I have to be a bit selective in what I'm going to talk about today. But if you have questions about other aspects of the project, then feel free to ask them. It's a major collaborative venture. I'll mention some individuals who've worked on particular aspects of the project material as we go through, but in particular, I want to start by mentioning the fact that I have two co-directors on the project, Gurkhan Mustafalu from Ankara Haji Bayram Veli University and Andy Fairburn from the University of Queensland, who've helped manage and develop the project. But many individual scholars have contributed as part of the team. I can't name them all, sadly, but I'll mention people as we proceed. In terms of the context of the project, I think I can set the scene by pointing out that there's been a lot of work on the development of the first sedentary agricultural and herding communities in the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia, the area of the Levant, North Mesopotamia, and the Zagros foothills over many, many decades. But actually work on related sites in central Anatolia followed on a little bit later. And I think whilst we're developing a reasonable understanding of the emergence of sedentary agricultural communities in the Fertile Crescent, it's really only been over the past 2 decades. We've started to get an understanding of the appearance and nature of, let's call them, for want of a better term, Neolithic communities in central Anatolia, and the degree to which they may have adopted plant cultivation and animal herding in using local species in central Anatolia, or whether perhaps central Anatolia is the first step of the spread of farming westwards, as perhaps implied by this diagram from a German museum catalogue, for example. I think we have been able to talk a bit about some of the bigger mechanisms that people are typically interested in terms of the adoption of sedentism, cultivation and herding. But really today I want to talk a little bit more about what it meant for the foragers caught up in this process to be involved in developing sedentary and agricultural behavior. So I want to take, if you like, a particular social perspective on this process and really unpack these large-scale phenomena to look at them more at a community and a household and individual level, and consider things such as whether the development of sedentism and agricultural practices was a monolithic phenomenon shared by all early sedentary communities, or whether there's a lot of variability in this regard, and in what way that is expressed in terms of social behaviours. In terms of the sites I'm talking about, I'm going to obviously particularly focus on our work at Boncuklu here, but we are doing this in conjunction with ongoing study of material we excavated at the site of Punabasha some years ago. And really it's by looking at this network of sites in the Konya plain of south central Anatolia, 1,000 meters above sea level on the Anatolian plateau, that I think we can really start to understand a little bit more about what was involved in the adoption of sedentism, cultivation and herding for the communities on the Anatolian plateau more broadly. The first couple of slides I'm not going to dwell on in great detail, and they just help me set the scene in terms of the issue of the appearance of cultivation and herding, which, as I said, sadly, I don't have time to explore in detail in the lecture. But I think the first thing to appreciate is that we've definitively established that Boncuklu was the earliest farming community that we have evidence for in the Konya plain. There's clear presence of the early cultivars at Boncuklu, in interesting contrast to earlier and contemporary Punabasha, for example. So we can say that domestic plants, cultivated plants, appear on the in the Konya plain from 8,300 BC calibrated onwards. I'll talk more about the dates in a moment. More or less contemporary with their appearance in Cappadocia, as far as we can document it so far. So this seems to be part of a central Anatolian phenomenon. Interestingly, what this graph is showing us here is that compared to just slightly later Neolithic sites, these domestic plants are not represented in great frequency or ubiquity at the site. And this is true whether we're looking at carbonized seed evidence or phytoliths, which are the less destructible parts of the plants preserved as silicified plant cells. So really, we are looking, I think, at indigenous forager communities who are just adding a little bit of cultivation to ongoing exploitation of the local landscape. And we think this is true, interestingly, of animal management as well. It's been a bit more tantalizing, the evidence up till now. We've got evidence from carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes that maybe the diets of sheep and goat were being affected by humans. And we've got animal dung on the site that suggests that people were collecting animal dung in a way that seems unlikely from unmanaged species. So we have hints of small amounts of caprine management at the site. The caprines only making up about 5% of the animal bones at the site. This sort of emerging picture is reinforced by very recent ancient DNA work done in collaboration with the Middle Eastern Technical University Ancient DNA Lab, where analyses of the Boncuklu and Punabasha sheep very clearly show that the genetic lineages that become important in the earliest farming communities, where we've clearly got domestic animals after 7,000 BC, probably just after 7,500, we see the genetic bottlenecking involved, are already present and exploited by the Punabasha and Boncuklu communities. The blue color indicates haplogroup B, which is clearly the ancestral lineage for the earliest domestic animals in central Anatolia. And even the specific haplotype represented by the squares is present in the local sheep population. So I think there's our emerging evidence of herding from the caprine diet and dung evidence, so coprolites have already made a sort of appearance, you see, is reinforced by this hot off the press ancient DNA evidence that's only been published in the past couple of weeks. So we are looking at a forager community engaging in very small scale cultivation and herding, I think. Which is an interesting context then in which to evaluate and understand the development of sedentism, which is the real focus of this lecture, because I think the appearance and development of sedentary behaviors has been less theorized and less unpacked than the evidence for the emergence of cultivation and herding. And the approach that I've been adopting over the past couple of years, really, I think, is not to see this as a uniform phenomenon. I mean, the classic definition of sedentary communities adopting settled life is that they occupy sites for year-round, perhaps for a number of years. It's often not specified in the definition how long that might be. But I think we can think of a more nuanced and sophisticated way of understanding this that allows us to see different types of early sedentary community as not necessarily being uniform in their residential practices. And as such, I've developed this diagram to suggest we can think about different axes of behavior, spectra of behavior that communities might fall along, including whether they've got multiple seasons of occupation at site, but also thinking about issues of longevity and continuity, commitment to place over the long term, and deliberate degrees of continuous occupation seems important as well. And I think you can see, looking at the phenomena already in the abstract in these terms, that you might well have communities that we might call sedentary falling at different points along these axes. So I would certainly suggest that communities might be called sedentary that range over this whole area of this grid, for example. So that immediately raises the question, what is the evidence for early sedentism at a site like Boncuklu, or maybe even Punabasha as well, to investigate this possibility of variability? First of all, we can look at the issue of longevity, and this allows me to introduce the question of the dating of the sites, the periods of occupation a little bit more. This diagram represents modeling of C14 dates using the Bayesian technique. I obviously don't have time to go into all these methodological details. You can feel free to ask about them at the ends, but actually this isn't a plot of individual dates. This is modeling of models, modeling of Bayesian models, to give us a clear indication that Boncuklu was occupied from just before 8,300 down to about 7,600 BC, for example. And Punabasha actually for an even longer time, the two sites overlapping between about 8,300 and about 7,800 BC. So that in the latter phases of Punabasha's occupation, they're actually contemporary settlements about 30 kilometers apart. But the key thing is to note immediately that these sites were both occupied for very long periods, 700 years in the case of Boncuklu, and maybe 1,500 years in the case of Punabasha. So that really is long-term commitment to place, perhaps of slightly different orders of magnitude, which is suggesting, I think, of one dimension of sedentary behaviors that I've mentioned already, but an indication of the degree of variability that might be involved. We can take it down, though, to the in-year practices as well. How many seasons were these settlements occupied for? They may have been occupied for centuries, but were they occupied year-round? Again, I won't go into all the detail, but you can see we have various biological indicators from Boncuklu and Punabasha of seasons of occupation. And you can see, I'll just sum it quickly in the Boncuklu diagram, that we really do have pretty solid evidence indicated by the dark bars of pretty intensive exploitation of these resources, seasonally available resources, for much of the year at Boncuklu. The evidence is strong. I think that Boncuklu is almost certainly a year-round occupation, at least for many years of the occupation of the site by the community as a whole. This is a community level perspective we're getting. Punabasha certainly suggests many seasons and months of occupation, but there's more room at Punabasha, I think, for people to have been seasonally absent. So maybe we have here some of this variability in sedentary behavior that I suggested is worth exploring. But we often talk about sedentism as a community level phenomenon, but we should also, I think, try and understand it in terms of what it meant for individuals in their life cycle and for the households or family units that they might have been part of. And I think we can start to unpack that as well. Part of the lecture title was life histories, of course, and we can look a bit at that through strontium and oxygen isotopes. This is very recent work of Jess Pearson from the University of Liverpool, for example, isn't yet published. So it needs a little bit of work. This is work in progress, I hasten to add. The strontium and oxygen isotopes are good indicators of where individuals spend their childhoods in terms of sampling different layers accumulating on the teeth. Of course, we have these individuals as adult burials on the site, so we know where they're buried, at least where they end up as dead individuals. But where did they spend their childhood? Well, in summary, the strontium and oxygen combined suggest that most of the male and female adults at Boncuklu that are buried at Boncuklu actually match a strontium and oxygen signature that would fit well with the Boncuklu locality up in this central part of the plain, as the diagram perhaps starts to suggest to you. I won't go through all the details. So most of the Boncuklu males and female adults that are buried there spent their childhood in the locality, at least. There are a couple of exceptions, though. One individual who perhaps spent a bit of time, a male, in some of his childhood in areas a little away from the site, probably to the north, and a female who even more clearly perhaps spent some of her time in areas to the south, on the southern edge of the plain. Perhaps she moved to Boncuklu in adulthood. But of course, this could reflect a degree of seasonal mobility for these individuals as well. So you can see, while most of the population seems well rooted in their Boncuklu locality, there may well be people who moved more or came in. And we'll meet some of these individuals when I start talking about life histories in a little bit more detail at the moment. The other thing I would point out, because this doesn't just map the strontium and oxygen for the Boncuklu individuals, it maps Punabasha individuals too, who are the little crosses. And you can see that this adult male, who I've singled out already, overlaps nicely with the Punabasha community. So perhaps he came from the Punabasha community or spent time in the same area in his childhood, which is very intriguing. We start to perhaps see relationships between communities as part of this question of what sedentism really meant for these early Neolithic communities. As I said, it's not just a question of overall longevity in terms of understanding these sorts of communities, nor even of where people were born and whether they moved around much, but also getting a sense of the continuities, the degree of continuity of the use of these settlements, and indeed of the houses. We've talked about community level practices, we've talked about individual level practices, but we can talk a bit about household practices as well, I think. And one of the notable things about Boncuklu is the way that continuity is built into the archaeological record, which I think is a strong symbolic reflection of continuity being important to the people that lived at Boncuklu. I can just take the first and most obvious example of this, which has been commented on about a number of other Neolithic settlements in central Anatolia as well. And that is the way in which the houses, and these seem to be residential structures with very similar plans. Generally at Boncuklu, we've excavated about 25 or 26 houses now. They're constantly rebuilt in the same location. The houses represent continuing reconstructions of the same house. In Area K, you see 4 images relating to the excavation of a series of houses in Area K. There are actually 6 houses in sequence built immediately one on top of the other. This house, building 2, for example, was replaced by this structure, building 9, which was replaced by this structure, building 3, which was replaced by 2 structures, building 1.1 and 1.2. They're rebuilt on the same location. What's this about? It isn't because space is crowded at the settlement. There are big open spaces. People could have rebuilt their houses in different locations. No, this is a deliberate choice. And I think it's about a desire to live over the dead, the ancestral dead, and the ancestral house as well. This reconstruction memorializes and symbolizes continuity and connections to the ancestors that are part of that continuity as well. You might think there's an element of speculation to that, and of course all good interpretation involves that anyway, but I think we do have some very direct evidence, and this is where consanguinity comes in. There you go, Nisha. Where we can actually now demonstrate, as a result of other collaboration with the ancient DNA team at Metu and other institutions as well, the way in which people buried under the houses at Boncuklu, the adults in particular, are directly related one to another. The little dotted lines here connect people that have first degree genetic relationships in this sequence of houses. The the bottom house is the earlier one, building 12. It's replaced by this one, building 14, that cuts down into it. And here you can see two siblings, the adult brother buried in building 12, and then his sister as an adult buried in the succeeding house, not long afterwards, presumably building 14. So there's direct continuity there. And in later phases of building 14, there's a mother and a son buried in that order, showing people living over their direct genetic relations and expressing continuity, I think, in these practices. Interestingly, there are additional insights, though. It's interesting that a young baby was buried, a neonate was buried with the adult female sister in this grave. She's not related to any of the other individuals in the building. So it's not to say, just because we have burials that are genetically directly connected, that everyone buried in the structure was necessarily a genetic relative. There probably were other forms of kinship that bound people together in these household groups. But I think this clearly emphasizes the way that burial and reconstruction stress continuity. I think the concept of ancestral houses and people identifying with the houses that they're living in and have connections to and are buried in is well brought out by the evidence for ritual and symbolic practices we have in these houses, often connected with what might be understood as the death and rebirth of the house through those continuous sequences. It's very interesting how, you know, at the end of the life of a phase of a house, or at the end of a house before it's reconstructed, the house seems very deliberately disarticulated and dismantled, the way that some human bodies are treated, and as I'll show you in a minute, and connected to those acts of deconstruction of a house and what ultimately involves the burial of the house before a new house is built on top of it. We see the placement in the removed post settings of very distinctive objects, special obsidian cores and tools, things like this unique bear, possibly bear human hybrid figure. So there's very distinct ritual practices connected with the dismantling and rebirth of both phases and these structures. And I would suggest that the continuities I'm talking about are very strongly underwritten by these ritual practices. So to summarize briefly in terms of what I've talked about so far, people in spatially and chronologically sequential houses are closely related. Genealogical ancestry, as we might term it, is an important part of house burial groups. And people become closely associated with ancestors, whether or not genetically or genealogically defined, I think, but also ancestral houses through the process of accessing and using and being buried in these houses. And the close time frames over which siblings must have been buried, and parents and children, I think, does stress the continuities, the direct continuities involved here. And the construction and deconstruction of these houses and their individual histories create continuity, a physical statement of continuity, I'd suggest. To continue in this vein, I think we've got other evidence that this is true as well. These houses are not static entities, but they're organically built up over time by their occupants. The houses have plaster floors that are repeatedly relaid, replastered. Here you can see a micromorphology block from this area of a building. You can see how many plaster floor layers there are that change the shape and character of the house, the settings within the house, and represent the organic growth of the house. But again, I think you can measure by looking at these micromorphology blocks something of the intensity and continuity of the building up of these structures. So it's something that the people that lived in the house created. They built continuity into these structures through repetitive practice. And of course, they remembered that as part of their daily, weekly, monthly, and annual existences. So they create this sense of continuity. I think this adds to a sense of household cohesion, whatever the precise constituency of these households might have been, but other things do as well. The repetitive way in which the space is divided up and recreated is very clear in individual structures. The specific basic layout is constantly repeated as the house is refurbished, but it's also true from house to house as the buildings are reconstructed. In particular, I've talked about this before, the houses are divided into what might be called dirty kitchen areas. This is a nice 3D scan we did of Building 21 in this season, so we're grateful for the Institute's support for allowing us to go and have an interesting COVID-19 season in Turkey this summer. The scanning is one thing that resulted from it. You can see neatly the way in which there's this sunken hearth area. You can see the burnt soils here. This is a kitchen area of the house. It's got a lot more patchy floors, often incorporating grey occupation sediments, as you can see here, whereas the larger southeastern 2/3 of the building seem to be given over to clean floors, which people might have socialized in. But it's particularly also in these areas, in the clean areas, we might call them, where we see the evidence for ritual practice and the burial of people under the houses that I've mentioned already. So there are very repetitive features to these houses, but interestingly, there's also, I think, very, very interesting indications of discrete identities within the structures. I've mentioned the distinctive ritual and symbolic practices, the way in which figurines, bits of obsidian are placed in pits, but so are animal bones, and especially animal skull parts are built into the walls and other features in the houses. And they seem to have a unique and distinctive configuration in each house. For example, in one of the buildings, building 4, you see the plan in the top right of the slide, there's a double wild cattle bucranium, for example, obviously a precursor to the sort of things that we see at Chatterley. In another wall, we have a bordure stuck into a niche, for example. No house replicates exactly or even particularly closely the specific configuration of these symbolic practices. So it seems to me these mark distinctive household identities whose strength is built up through repetitive practice and memory of what happens in these houses. Just to change tack a little bit, I think the way in which these houses are constantly refurbished, which I see as a strong indication of the continuities that underpin early sedentary behavior, also offer us a distinctive opportunity to look at the histories of these houses and the people that lived in them as well. So let me explain. As I said, there's regular replastering, and there are many replasterings of the house floors. Here's this sequence of buildings in Area K I've mentioned already, and you can see how many plaster floors there were in each of these buildings, adding up to about 75 floors over the 6 buildings. I think there's every reason to believe, both ethnohistorical evidence but also C14 dating evidence, that these were annual plasterings. Makes sense they were annual because these are not hard lime plasters, but clay plasters that would have worn. And that's why ethnohistorically people replastered once a year. It's not likely to be more than that because of the effort, but also the time taken in drying these floors and the need for warm summer weather for that purpose. I think annual is likely. Maybe they weren't quite annual, but I think certainly the C14 evidence, we've got the Bayesian analysis that we've done of the Area K sequence, which suggests between about 60 and 100 years of occupation of these 6 buildings would strongly match with an annual replastering of each of these houses, maybe with the occasional missing of a year. But obviously, given the limits of the Bayesian analysis and the C14 dating, I think it's just as likely it's an annual replastering. This gives us what I've called elsewhere floor clocks for measuring the length of occupation of these structures. And of course, because we can phase in the burials and the other activities of refurbishment and other ritual practices in the buildings, it gives us a floor clock to measure the frequency of these activities and understand when in the history of the houses people died and were buried, and the relationships between those events and those individuals as well. One of the first things you can see thereby, if I'm right about the annual periodicity of the replastering, is the way that many of these houses weren't necessarily used for very long, some for only 6 or 7 years, some up to 25 or 28 years. for example. But you should understand these as perhaps not that long lived. And in some instances, quite a few people who lived in an individual house would have lived in its successor as well, or maybe even if they didn't continue living in it, would have accessed it and visited it potentially. And that's an interesting indication of continuity across these occupations as well. Obviously, I am pointing to a lot of continuity. And just as an aside, really, it's worth speculating on how that continuity was underpinned. How did this community of foragers, which after all are only engaging in very small scale cultivation and herding, for example, underpin the continuous occupation of this settlement? Especially when I'd like to point, in the light of one additional factor I'd like to point out, which is we don't really have much evidence for built storage structures of any sort in these buildings. I'm sure there was basket storage, but there's none of the clay bins that we see or side rooms that we see in slightly later sites in the area, like Çatalhöyük or Janasan, for example, nor do they seem to be storage pits. The pits we have are mostly burial pits. And I think the answer lies in some of the species you see here and the fact that the site was occupied in a wetland steppe mosaic. There's lots of evidence for intensive exploitation of fish, waterfowl, and indeed other aquatic creatures like frogs. 90% of the microfauna are marsh frogs. And I think we have really good evidence that they're eating them as well as things like water voles. And this is where the old friends from the title, the coprolites, come in again. These are human coprolites, human poo in effect. And actually we find they're full of things like frog bones and water voles. So it seems that this intensive exploitation of the wetland mosaic obviated the need for large-scale storage. I think they had modest-scale storage in baskets in these structures, and that's what underpins the sedentary, continuous occupations that we can see. So that was a little bit of an aside, and I want to come back now to what I've started to talk about in looking at the floor frequency and continuity, which is this question of histories of households and histories of individuals that we can obviously fit in with our floor clocks to the stories of these buildings. We can get that, we can integrate life histories and house histories because we have these burials, of course, under the house floors. And it does appear that quite a lot of people who probably were in some way related to the house, I don't know if they always lived in it, were buried under that in the house, but probably not everyone. And here I've summarized the numbers of individual burials in particular houses or sequences of houses. And sometimes you can see, especially one or two of the longer lived houses like building 21 and building 14, that we have a reasonable number of individuals that might match with a 20 to 28 year period of occupation. But sometimes, for example, take the area K sequence over 75 years, we've got either 2 or maybe 4 individuals buried in that sequence. That doesn't seem like enough. So there do seem to be, as has been noted for other Neolithic sites, some missing dead here. It seems that quite often many people connected to the house were buried under it, but not everyone. And that's interesting given the stress I've laid on the importance of households and household continuity and household ancestry for this community. I think as a result of keeping digging, of course, we have some of the answer to this because we do have burials in external areas. There are people, for whatever reason, who weren't buried under houses. And I think we now know a lot more about them. They are sometimes buried in the same way as the house burials, as full articulated inhumations. That's what we see in the house burials, as you may have noticed. Some of them have grave goods like this shell necklace, and others don't, like this individual. But also, interestingly, there's more variability in the mortuary practices in the external areas. So we find skull detachment and disarticulation of human remains and circulation and deposition of those elements in the open spaces that can be seen as important foci of probably communal and collective activity that involved an element of ritual as well, just like the occupation of the houses. And I mentioned the coprolites. It's interesting to see what was going on in these open areas and that might have been part of social and collective activity, because we have in the same area as the burials, human toilet areas, which seem to have been used on a collective and social basis, you might say, right in the middle of the settlement, interestingly. And some of the burials even are found directly in those coprolite areas. Here you can see a large number of human feces, for example. And this burial was buried, this adult male, young adult male was buried during the accumulation of these coprolites. The burial cuts through coprolite layers and it's overlaid by coprolite areas as well. So these are interesting areas of collective activity in which ritual was practiced as well. And presumably the people buried in this area must have come from the houses. They are some of the missing dead, but you have to ask why they're singled out. And I think we have some of the answer I'll mention in a moment or two. But connected to that, you know, I think it is interesting to see the various ways in which this group might be different. For example, when we come to grave goods, it does look like there are some differences. So there's an average of only about 25% of the burials in the houses have grave goods, and only 18% of the adults buried in the houses have grave goods. But in the external areas, there are definitely more, 44% on average. And in places like Area M, I've shown you some images of the burials and the disarticulated human remains, it's as high as 58%. So it's interesting that in these more collective open spaces where humans are being buried and their remains processed and heads circulating, for example, that there's more display of burial goods connected to the treatment of human remains in that area. So why are the people who were buried in the open spaces, presumably coming from the houses, treated, living to a degree in the houses, treated differently? Well, when we look at the carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes, this is again work of Jess Pearson relating to their diet, we can see immediately from this graph the animals that these people ate, in general terms at least, ate, their isotopes are shown in the lower part of the graph here. You've got the human isotope shown on the top here, and the open squares are the individuals whose disarticulated remains circulated and deposited in the open spaces. And you can see how they separate out fairly neatly from the humans whose bodies are buried under the houses. The people treated in these open spaces in distinctive ways seem to have slightly different diets. They probably ate more of these species down here, which are aquatic species, the fish, the water birds, the frogs, for example, that we find in the coprolites in these open areas. So this group is separated off from the people that are buried under the houses, but also united as a group by presumably sharing meals together over the long term. These aren't individual diet, daily diets as might be reflected in the coprolites. These are an averaging of diets over 10 years. So people are eating together and being buried together and united presumably through those things over the long term. And I suggest that, these are a distinct corporate group operating within the community. So we have households, but we also have continuities for other forms of corporate or collective group operating together in the community, reflected in their mortuary treatments, and reflecting probably ancestry in terms of a long sequence of burials of these individuals in the open spaces. So there's ancestry underpinning this collectivity as well, I would argue. We have interesting hints about some of the distinctive features of some of these individuals, at least, as well, in terms of understanding this at an individual level, in that the strontium and oxygen isotope graph I've shown you already has allowed me to introduce some of these individuals to you already. People who aren't buried under houses in this graph include the adult male who shares features of strontium and oxygen isotope with the Punabasha individuals we talked about already, and this adult female who seems to have spent some of her childhood in areas to the south of Boncuklu. So it is quite interesting, perhaps, that people who may not have had natal houses in Boncuklu and maybe spent some time away in their childhood are some of the group that are treated separately at death. And again, I think that probably reflects certain continuities in who this particular corporate group was at Boncuklu. I just want to, I think I've probably got about 5 to 10 minutes left. I'm not quite sure exactly when we started after the AGM. But I just want to finish off maybe by going back to trace the life stories of some of these individuals in the household groups, because I think that tells us some quite interesting things about the nature of these household collectives, as we might call them, and the continuities that are reflected in their behavior, and the way in which we probably are looking at continuing households with distinct identities. Remember, we know the sort of genetic relationships, relatedness of some of the individuals buried in this sequence of buildings, building 12, building 14, and a replacement building, building 5, for example. And we also can match them into the floor clock that I've mentioned already. So once you start to do that, you really, I think, really understand the history of these households and the extent to which there might be patterning as well. So this is, I obviously don't have time to go through in great detail all of the information contained here, but this in a way is a little household history of this sequence of buildings, building 12, building 14, building 5 at Boncuklu, mapping on the burials of particular individuals, including information about their biological history and other aspects of their behavior over the period of occupation of these houses. We can say, you know, how many floors, maybe how many years later a particular burial occurred in this sequence, for example. So just to start, take you through, for example, 18 floors, let's say actually 7 floors after building 12 was built, a 5 to 9-year-old individual was buried, child, obviously, who had a very distinctive 100 shell bead necklace and ornamented clothing covering them, for example. About 11 years later, the adult male, who we know to be the brother of the first burial in building 14, was buried. We can look, I think, in terms of the biological history of these individuals to see some repeated features. A lot of the adults in particular show evidence of significant arthritic changes to their skeleton, and often infections of tibia and femur, for example. They show evidence of lots of hard work, both males and females, over their lifetimes. And they also show interesting repeated patterns of diet as well. The adult males, for example, perhaps had a slightly greater degree of BOS in their diet, but the adult females show a greater proportion probably of aquatic resources and wild boar in their diet. So there are patterns over time in the burial of individuals through this quite long sequence of 60 plus floors, 60 plus years, I would argue. We can say fairly precisely in the last 2/3 of the 83rd century BC. And we get some really interesting additional insights as well when we tie that into the mobility evidence. Actually, most of these individuals, the strontium and oxygen isotope indicates, were from that group that spent their childhood at Boncuklu. But actually, one of the individuals must have come and gone to Boncuklu, probably in his 30s and 40s. This is the last person buried that we know about the genetic relationship of in building 14. He's the son that I've mentioned already. We know about his departure from the site, not from strontium and oxygen, but from carbon and nitrogen, because his diet shows very high nitrogen, in particular the consumption of lots of C4 plants. And actually most of the animals at Boncuklu represented in this part of the diagram hadn't consumed C4 plants. So he's unlikely to have consumed animals eating C4 or indeed C4 plants directly himself at Boncuklu. He probably went away for significant periods in his 30s or 40s and came back to join that household and be buried at Boncuklu late in the history of the house. Interestingly, ancient DNA as well tells us that he suffered from hepatitis B. He's one of the earliest extant cases, I think, of hepatitis B in human history. So we're getting really interesting indications of life histories, but ones that point out, I think, distinctive patterns. It's very interesting then that, you know, we see this sequence of individuals with these very distinctive patterns of osteoarthritis and the same sorts of healed injuries and infections, for example. But also the way in which they're treated at death is quite telling as well. If we go back to the table I showed you about the average frequency of grave goods in house burials for adults, you can see it's 18%. But you might have noted from my previous diagram, actually, that none of the adult burials, even though we have quite a few in this sequence of houses in this part of Boncuklu, have grave goods. It's only the children that seem to have grave goods, and that seems to be a particular household practice. That's a tradition of this particular household that represents the distinctive identity and continuity of this group of people. So I think I don't want to take up too much of your time, obviously, after a busy AGM as well. So I think I can just draw this to a conclusion, building on what I've said already, by suggesting that we've definitely seen the importance of what I would call as ancestral-based collectivities in shaping social arrangements, but also underpinning sedentary behaviours at Boncuklu, and very much mediating what might be called more individual aspects of behaviour and aspects of personal identity. If we think it's things like the household tradition that individuals belong to that have a role in deciding whether or not they have particular sets of grave goods buried with them, for example, or whether they're buried in external areas with other people that they spent some of their lives with, consuming food with, and maybe exploiting particular resources in the landscape. I think you can see the way in which probably personal identities and personal histories are actually strongly influenced and contained, I would suggest, by these collective ancestral traditions that underpin this early sedentary behavior. So I think that's the most important point I wanted to make through this more perhaps nuanced and complex understanding of what early sedentism meant for Neolithic communities in Anatolia. So at that point, I'll stop and allow you to persecute me with questions if you still have the energy to do that. Thank you. Guess I can stop sharing. Let's see.
Thank you very, very much, Doug. That was fantastic. Everything from frog bones to floor clocks, and you even managed to pronounce consanguinity, which I almost just managed to do. That was absolutely fantastic. I think it's wonderful to see how the latest scientific developments are coming together with, traditional dirt archaeology, as it were. The science is coming together to layer up these different interpretations, and how this idea of ancestral behaviors can be matched and nuanced with the genetic evidence for biological and genetic connections as well. That's extremely exciting. You have a lot of questions already, and I don't think we have too much time, so I'm going to start with the questions immediately, if that's all right. I'm going to group some of these questions together when they're thematically related. We start with two questions which relate to the relationship between Boncuklu and Çatalhöyük. Jeff Guy asks whether the residents of Boncuklu may have been related in any form to those of Çatalhöyük. And Alan Mellart asks what is the average age of the inhabitants at Boncuklu, because he remembers it being roughly about 30 years old at Çatal.
Great, thanks for those questions, and hello, Alan. I can't see you, but we met a few years ago in Istanbul, I remember. So in terms of continuities, I think there's a lot of evidence for certain sorts of continuity between Boncuklu and Çatal that would suggest that it's quite possible that the community that we find at Boncuklu a few centuries later make up at least part of the Çatalhöyük community, or at least people sharing the sorts of behaviors we see at Boncuklu, because you have this very structured use of domestic space that we see both at Çatalhöyük and Boncuklu. The houses divided into clean and dirty areas, combined with the regular replastering, the very distinctive ritual practices connected to burying people under floors, and placing things in post holes when houses are reconstructed. So I think there's lots of evidence for continuities in those really quite distinctive practices. And we do have other Anatolian aceramic Neolithic sites, but none of them show quite those specific features that seem to be the antecedent of Çatalhöyük. Of course, we now have ancient DNA as well, so we can say a little bit more about the genetic relationships between people at Boncuklu and Çatal, and there's a lot of evidence for continuity in these genetic lineages. I think we can't at the moment, because still, I mean, we've been very lucky at Boncuklu at having the amount and degree of ancient DNA preservation we've got in the humans and animals. It's been less well preserved at Çatal, possibly because of the way they treated the bodies and burning the houses down and that sort of thing. And at the moment, they've got a number of children they've analysed rather than adults that have produced ancient DNA. But generally, I think it's clear that the people at Çatalhöyük, derive a lot of their genetic lineage from the same people that the Boncuklu community do as well. That could mean that there's direct genetic connections between Boncuklu and Çatalhöyük, but it doesn't absolutely have to. It could mean that there's shared ancestry in a more general sense. But I think the cultural continuities do strongly hint. Plus the fact, of course, Boncuklu is only 9.5 kilometers away, so that's an extra hint for us. And I think Alan then asked about the average age of death, and probably it's going to be in the 30s, so it's not so far off Çatal. It is interesting though that our age distribution is quite an evenly spread one. I think we have, if you take the adults, about a third of the adults died in their late teens and 20s, let's say. About a third die between the age of 30 and 50, and you saw probably quite a few 30 to 50-year-olds on the little tables I showed. And then another third survived to over 50, which is actually, if you take that as the adult population, I think that's, perhaps a little bit more weighted to the, my age end of the spectrum, we might say, than some sites. It's probably a bit higher, maybe than Çatal, even though it's clear, from the amount of wear and tear on the skeletal material as assessed by Jess Pearson, that people evidence at Çatal. There's lots of evidence of arthritis, of infected bones from injuries, probably, and lots of evidence of carrying weights, impacted vertebrae in the spine, for example. So they worked hard in that sense of carrying loads and moving over distance at Boncuklu. But I think they probably had pretty healthy diets in terms of the diversity of the diet, which probably helped. And obviously they live with disease, hepatitis B. That's a really interesting one. We've got evidence quite possibly of some sort of lung infection that might be equivalent to tuberculosis. We can't be sure it is, but we've got that as well. So they lived with diseases quite effectively, I think.
Related to that, actually, can I just ask about the infant and child burials then? It didn't seem, from what I could see, that there were a particularly large number of those. Are we seeing an accurate representation of infant mortality, or do you think some of the infants were disposed of elsewhere? I mean, that's not impossible, but I think it is. I mean, it's true that it is quite interesting, I think, that in the, the building 1214 sequence, there weren't maybe quite as many, but there were a fair number there, depending on exactly how you define infants, but let's say that children generally, I think there's about 5 probably from that sequence of the building 1214. In other places there are a bit less, but in the open areas there are quite a lot. I think about 25% of our human remains are, children, basically, let's say between the ages of 0 and 14, depending on exactly how you want to define it. So it's a fairly healthy proportion. I think, of course, actually, it may be that those burials survived. There's slight marginally less because those burials survived the taphonomic processes of being in an archaeological site. I mean, never mind maybe our excavation processes, but we do find quite a lot of
perinatal remains. And, the reason, for example, in my sequence of 6 buildings from Area K, I suggested there were between 2 and 4 burials is because we actually have 2 burials very clearly, one of a perinatal individual and one of an old adult. But we also then have some, young infant bones in those burials that may actually have been, there are different options. Maybe that's a disarticulation of very young children as part of a mortuary practice, or maybe it's because the burial pits cut through earlier burial pits under the houses if people are being reburied, and then those burials are redeposited. So I think that, the process of burying people in the Neolithic probably disturbed earlier burials, and the very youngest infants are likely to have, they would have had the smallest pits and most likely to have been damaged and not recognized, I think.
Absolutely, that makes sense. I'm going to go straight back to our questions because we still have quite a few to get through. We've got 2 now. I'm going to cluster another 2 questions together to do with the relationship between Boncuklu and Punabasha. Delwyn Samuel says, he asked that regarding seasonality, are you able to discern any seasonal fluctuations within the overall span of occupation at Punabasha and Boncuklu? I think there was some of that during the talk. And we also have a question from Akiva Sanders, who says, is it possible that individuals that have isotopic similarities to individuals at Punabasha were involved in group or seasonal or symbolically important hunting expeditions based out of Punabasha?
I like, because you've just asked that, and that was, a multi-phrase question. I will simply answer that first by saying, yes, I think it's highly likely that individual that has a similar isotopic signature in terms of strontium and oxygen to the Punabasha, the contemporary Punabasha individuals, clearly spent, some time in the same area, and that's maybe because that person came from that community or met up with them. But remember, that's in childhood. That's a reflection of childhood activity. The teeth layers that have those signatures are formed between the ages of 2 and 8. So that person was doing it in childhood. So they probably weren't, doing it as an individual. They were doing it connected to adults, which, so there's sort of missing individuals there that were part of that pattern as well. So I do think it is part of a bigger pattern, of activity where maybe people met up, or people are actually moving between these settlements. They're only 30 kilometers apart. It shouldn't surprise us. Difficult at the moment to quite distinguish what it might be. That adult male, you actually saw a picture of him. He's quite interesting. He has a nice Nassarius Tritia gibellosus marine shell necklace around his neck in the burial. Interestingly, they're quite a common species at Punabasha too. So, you wonder if there are symbolic connections being made that way. So that answers that question, sort of, obviously not completely definitively. In terms of the seasonality, I think it is interesting that the Boncuklu seasonality evidence suggests maybe at least some seasonal absences. And I actually think the strontium and oxygen isotope evidence from Punabasha would support that for the Punabasha group. And that's because there's a really weird thing, which I didn't have time to go into on that chart, but actually you obviously saw the oxygen gives us a north-south climb. And actually, of course, the Punabasha individuals are in the wrong place for that, because if you remember from the map, Punabasha's to the south of Boncuklu, but their isotope signatures look like they ought to have been spending time north of Boncuklu. So I think there are periods when they're spending time to the north. Now, Delwyn asked if maybe there's some, history of change in seasonality through these sequences. Punabasha, I think at the moment it's quite difficult for us to say for sure. We need to do a bit more work, hopefully imminent at the site, to really learn a bit more about the earlier phases of the site. We understand the phase contemporary with Boncuklu best. At Boncuklu, so far, one of the really interesting things is how consistent the seasonality evidence through the sequence is. We've deliberately, obviously often the seasonality stuff is presented as on a whole site multi-phase basis. We've broken it down into different phases, and we see from the birds particularly, but some of the other seasonality signatures, the same evidence through most of our excavated sequence. But since we've only just started digging the very earliest levels at Boncuklu, and again this summer, I think we can comment really in that regard. I think some aspects of the very earliest settlement at Boncuklu does look as if it might have a bit more of a seasonal character. So once we get the seasonality evidence and analyze those features a little bit more, we might be able to document maybe increasing sedentism through the sequence. Part of the reason I say that is the buildings we've got in these earliest phases, they seem to be quite light structures. They don't have the same sort of, there's repetition in the flooring, but they don't have quite the same degree of thick plaster floors. They don't have mud brick walls. They're set in cuts. They seem to have wooden superstructures. So they look a little flimsier, for example. And maybe there are hints that there are phases of waterlogging at the site when maybe people weren't using it or wouldn't have been using it so much. So I think there are interesting hints. So it's a great question, Delwyn, and hopefully, we may be able to give some more clear answers. But at the moment, for the bulk of the Boncuklu sequence, it looks very similar all the way through.
Right, fantastic. We have another clutch of questions around food and subsistence. Can I start with a question from Stephen Mitchell? We have two Stephen Mitchells in this virtual room. And one of the Stephen Mitchells, I think not our outgoing council, the other Stephen Mitchell is asking about the risk buffering or the risk management strategy involved in different subsistence strategies. He mentions emmer wheat and other different types of crops. I'm not going to read out the entire question because it's very long, but his question is it enough to base mostly your subsistence on emmer wheat, or are other things necessary in addition to the emmer and the meat?
I think we're pretty clear that the cereal and actually the legume exploitation, because they grew peas as well at Boncuklu and lentils too. These seem to be quite a small component of the subsistence practices. The frequency and ubiquity of these plants in the record, even in the phytolith record, is much lower than at sites like Janasan 3 or Çatalhöyük, for example, that are just a few centuries later and probably have very similar preservation conditions, for example. So I think really we're looking at a forager community that has added a bit of cultivation to its practices and a little bit of animal management too. Like you could regard that actually as a good risk buffer for the foraging community, adding these additional practices, of course. And maybe that is part of it, although I think there are other factors. I don't believe they're keeping such, or managing such small numbers of caprines just for a little bit of extra meat. I think there might be additional reasons for that, not least what we find on the site, the animal dung, extremely useful for fuel. It's all about poo, you see, really. So I think, they're probably not all about risk buffering, but I think the very breadth of the diet that we see and its seasonal variability was the key risk buffering mechanism. As I said, I think there was a little bit of storage probably, but not particularly large scale compared to later Neolithic communities. So I think it's their ability to happily, eat lots of frogs, which would have been in profusion in the environment, lots of water voles, when and as seemed fit. I'm sure that, these frogs' legs, they're big beasts by frog standard. People, I'm sorry to tell you this, people have, connected to the team, have done experiments in this. Of course, I have to say it's not our friendly local frogs. They've done it back in the UK. Our frogs happily shower with us sometimes, really. So there are friends at Boncuklu now, but some people connected to the team have eaten them and say the frog's legs are excellent, for example. But I think that ability to, exploit those resources, which were, okay, not optimal forager food in the sense of being, big return, but probably very easy to collect. The kids may well have gone out and collected these and, they were there to eat when you needed them if there was a shortage of other things. In the winter, there's lots of migratory birds that pass through in huge flock sizes, at least according to not current day, sadly, talking of water management, but fairly recent records. So there have been lots of aquatic birds in the winter, wild aurochs and boar to hunt of a good size, year-round, resident in the fringes of the wetlands. Certainly wetland plants to consume, nuts in the hills. So I think that diversity of diet to which cultivation was added was the trick.
Fantastic. Actually, I know that my own children would love to go around catching frogs if I gave them half a chance. We've had a little bit of a clarification. We do not have two Stephen Mitchells in the room, I'm afraid. One of them is actually Hele Güne. Welcome, Hele, and sorry that you seem to have just a different name. We're going to have to move on because I've got one eye on the time. Very closely related to the questions that you've just been answering, Hande Çubukçu has asked about the ratio of the diet of Boncuklu residents, including grains and legumes, given that they weren't much in the way of storage structures. I think you've perhaps already answered that it's relatively low. It is perhaps more of a risk buffering. In which case, can I move you on to another question, because there are so many to get through, from Jeffrey Edgson, who is asking whether it's possible to use chemical or other kinds of tests or protein tests to see which parts of the animals were consumed. Can you test the coprolites in some way? Do we know whether they're eating the fat, the muscle, the marrow, offal?
Actually, well, Louise Martin, who works on the zooarchaeological material, also with a PhD student of ours, Özlem Sarataş, from who's currently a PhD student at Liverpool. They've looked at this through classic studies of the butchery of the animals, and indeed including the butchery of the frogs, if that's an appropriate term. So I think we're pretty clear that actually there's and again, this is probably related to this risk buffering aspect, there's a very intensive processing of the animal carcasses, for example. Sadly, a lot of our bones don't survive particularly well on the site, not just because they're 10,000 years old or because, clumsy archaeologists are tripping all over them when they're digging them, but actually because in the Neolithic, they were smashed up for marrow extraction. We find foot bones, for example, that are punctured for marrow extraction. So marrow extraction was big, grease rendering was big. And that's, again, probably because it's a bit of a storable product. You get your marrow ball, as it were. You can preserve them. You can often add particular herbs or other ingredients to them. And then you can reutilize them as the year goes, maybe to help make stews and that sort of thing. So there is really intensive processing of the animal remains that we can, address through these really classic but still sophisticated zooarchaeological methods. Having said that, I think we're sort of starting on a phase of a coprolite project, really. I mean, the coprolites, we've so far identified what's in the coprolites through more classic microscopic, methods. But we can use protein. We've got lots of small bone fragments that aren't immediately identifiable to species, but using proteomic methods, we will be able to identify them to species. So we'll have a better idea of the proportions of, larger mammal to these small mammals in the particular coprolites. Of course, if we're really lucky as well, we'll have ancient DNA preserved in the coprolites that will point to what they're consuming, even when it maybe wasn't, preserved as bone fragments. And we can look at the phytoliths and the starches in the coprolites to suggest what the mix of plant and animal matter in a particular meals might have been. We've got thousands of these coprolites, so I think there's a great, opportunity to really explore variability in individual diets, maybe even on a seasonal basis, but across individuals too. And we're looking at starches in dental calculus as well, and indeed the molecular biological component of the calculus too, which tells us about what people are consuming. So we can look at both ends, if I can phrase it indelicately, in terms of the input and the output, and that tells us something maybe about the gut biome as well, and what the diet was doing to that, which is, I think, of great interest to the medical fraternity. They're very interested in how different diets may have affected the gut biome over the long term, because obviously it's implicated in all sorts of health outcomes. So I think the study of the coprolites plus the dental calculus will allow us to address some of these issues a bit more. But the zooarchaeology is already telling us an interesting picture, I think.
Fantastic. Teeth and poo are the key to all of our answers. Given that we are already in so many ways, we're already 2 minutes past the hour, but there is one final question which is coming from Christina Tsoraki, who asks if there are any variations in the material assemblages between the earlier layers of Boncuklu and the later occupation levels. I know that you said you've only just recently started excavating these earlier levels, but can you see changes in the type of activities taking place over time?
Well, that's a great question, Christina. Hi. The answer is yes, as of this summer just past, actually, because I said we had started digging the earlier, what seemed to be the earliest levels at the site a couple of seasons ago, but obviously it's taken us a while to really expand an exposure of them and get to grips on them. And we've only, one of the intriguing things, which again I think might be related to a more seasonal pattern of use, is actually both the artifacts and the animal bones in those very earliest levels occur in lower density than in the later midden deposits and in the later structures too, which is already one interesting difference. But I certainly think, as some people might know, chipstone is my first love, and obviously I still take a close interest in it. And actually I think the chipstone assemblages are showing some differences from those very earliest levels with the later ones. For the rest of the sequence, between 8,300 and probably about 7,800 BC, there's no obvious chronological variation in the chipstone. There's some spatial variation, but not really chronological variation. But for the first time, I think we started picking up something that suggests some differences. So I do think probably the Boncuklu sequence, when we get some C14 dates, will go back a little bit before 8,300 BC. And I guess the exciting thing is how far.
Only time will tell. And speaking of time, we do not need floor clocks to tell us that we are towards the end of our time today in our session. Thank you so much, Doug. That's provoked a huge amount of thought and conversation. Any talk of poo is always fun of an evening. There are lots of thanks which have been left in the chat and also in the Q&A. I think everyone has really appreciated your talk this evening. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to pause and bring it back to Stephen or Lut and see if there are any closing comments related to the AGM. If there are not, if neither of you wish to unmute yourself or to say anything, then in that case, I'd like to say thank you to all of our fantastic audience then. Stephen.
Nish, thank you so much for doing a fantastic job in presenting the lecture, and thank you, Doug, for a wonderful lecture, even to somebody who works at the other end of antiquity. That was completely compelling. Do please turn it into an article for Anatolian Studies, as one of the questions that wasn't posed asked, will this be published? I would devoutly support that wish. It's great to have a splendid audience and a host of intense questions for a speaker who could manage them as I only wish I could manage questions at the end of a lecture. And it's wonderful that you've all been here. I wish everybody warmest wishes for the festive season or the semi-festive season that awaits us, and look forward to participating with you in BIAA events in the weeks and months ahead. There are an awful lot that come through on the prompts, on the advertisements for what's on, and we'd like to see you there. I shall certainly be at those of them that I've got the energy for, and wish everybody a peaceful 3 weeks left of 2021, and all the very best for 2022. I don't know if Lut wants to add a word or two to what I have to say, but I shall sign off at that point.
I think you covered it all pretty well, but I too would like to say thank you to Douglas for a fantastic lecture, and to Nish for moderating it so wonderfully, and to everybody who stayed till now, and to all for questions and answers and everything. And thanks for joining us. Earlier, there was a plea for people to become a member, and I would really like to repeat that plea, because for a charity like the BIAA, every pound counts. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, and like Stephen said already, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and see you in 2022. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.